Herb Chilstrom was born early in Depression years to Swedish parents in southern Minnesota. Educated at Augsburg College, ordained a Lutheran pastor in the Augustana Synod, served the church in both parish and classroom until elected bishop of the Minnesota Synod, and later in 1987 elected to be the first presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. His wife Corinne is also an ordained Lutheran pastor, but was not able to join him for our session today. We're pleased to have Bishop Chilstrom here to help us reflect on the first 25 years in the ELCA, and perhaps to have him offer some insight as to where our faith in Christ might be leading us in the days ahead. I'm sure he will be commenting, but Ann and I have enjoyed the daily devotional book that Herb and Corinne have put together, Every Morning New, and also in his book that he has on his life and ministry and the ELCA, A Journey of Grace, both books in the back table and upstairs. I noticed that Herb described himself in this way: an evangelical conservative with a radical social conscience. So I challenge you in the course of his presentation to see if you can detect some of those traits. So, Bishop Wilson, good to have you here. Let me make
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Now what do I do with this? Good to be with you. I was here at Zumbro at some point, but at this stage of life, I don't know how it is for you, but I look back and it's kind of a big mush. So when people say, wow, you were here at such and such a time for such and such an occasion, I just say, if you say so. But it's good to be back this morning and to share this time with you. The suggestion is that we talk about the call. And I want to begin with some comments about that, and then I'll gradually move into the major part of what I want to say about the books that I brought here today. We as Lutherans believe that everything begins with God. It doesn't begin with us, it begins with God. We believe that God comes to us first and foremost in our baptism. Even when we don't know what's going on and can't believe for ourselves, we believe that God in God's grace comes to us and makes us children of God. Several years ago, in fact, it was probably 30 years ago, I was here in Rochester when the Minnesota Synod, of which I was bishop at that time, had a youth gathering. And they had one of the best themes that I think I've ever seen for a convention. It was born again. And they put the big words up in front of the auditorium, born again. But then, around the whole auditorium, they had the words born again and again and again and again and again. And I thought, that's the way it is. Because we are born again in baptism, but we also believe that that needs to be renewed every day. One day a young person came to me and said, Bishop, what's your favorite Bible verse? And I love that question because for a long time my favorite Bible verse has been from Romans chapter 6, verse 4. We were buried with Christ by baptism into his death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we might walk in newness of life. Sometimes we get criticized as Lutherans for not talking about being born again. But if you go back to our roots in Martin Luther, he said we should be born again every morning. So today, stop and thank God for your baptism, whether it happened as an infant or sometime after that. Thank God for your baptism, because that's the place where you were called to be a disciple. And how you work that out in the rest of your life may have been in many, many different ways, as you can see in this room. And yet it all begins in our baptism. When we organized the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America back in 1987, we came very soon to develop a mission statement. And the mission statement was this, that we want to be a church so deeply and confidently rooted in the gospel of God's grace that we are free to give our lives joyfully in witness and in service. I love that mission statement because when I think of that statement, I see the two dimensions of the cross. First of all, there's the vertical. We are rooted in the gospel of God's grace, and we are made free by grace through faith. And then if that's true, then you ask the question, what are we going to do about that? And we say we give our lives joyfully in witness and service. So you've got, as I say, the two dimensions of the cross. The vertical, God's grace, rooted in grace, and then the horizontal, therefore we give our lives in joyful witness and service. Now, I'd like to maybe give you a 5-minute course in Lutheran history. How's that? 5 minutes. If I were to ask you the question, where was the first Lutheran church built in the 48 states? What would you guess? Where do you think it was built? No, you're on the East Coast. It was right in the middle of Manhattan. And guess where the people came from that built that first church? I gave you a clue by saying Manhattan. What was the first colony there? Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch. Believe it or not, there were some Dutch Lutherans that came with Peter Stuyvesant, and they built a little church in Manhattan Island. You know what street it was on? You won't believe this. Wall Street. Wall Street. Well, as you know from Revolutionary history, the British came along and they pushed out the Dutch, and they scattered far and wide. But and of course the congregation died. But I've often said that we had a good, clever lawyer to discover exactly where that place was, and go back and somehow reclaim it. All of our financial problems with the ELCA would be resolved. Anyway, that was the first building. Because this is the 25th anniversary of the ELCA, I want to tell you a little bit about what happened since that time. As you know, Germans came in large numbers, and they settled in New York, Pennsylvania, and down through the Virginia and the Carolinas. Then they spread out into Ohio, and they were the first large segment of Lutherans that came to America. Then about 150 years ago, the Scandinavians started coming. And I'm guessing, given this church is of Norwegian background, and many of you are probably of Norwegian background, I'm guessing that many of you in this room would say, yes, my great-grandparents came to the United States in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, along about in there. Because that's when the Great Flood came from Northern Europe. And many of us trace our roots to that time. My great-grandparents came in 1853. And they settled, first of all, near Milwaukee. Then they came over here to Minnesota, and they settled near Morristown, right over here. Then they went up north of Wilmer. They kept following the frontier. During the Sioux Uprising, they lost 20 of their neighbors, were killed, and of course many Native Americans. They fled and ended up right down here in the Cannon River, just east of Cannon Falls, near Cannon River Lutheran Church. So that's kind of a bit of my history. Then eventually, part of the family moved up to Litchfield, and that's where I grew up. Anyway, during those early years, we pretty much stayed in our nationality enclaves. I was not just a Lutheran for the first 25 years of my life, I was a Swedish Lutheran. And some of you would say I was a Norwegian Lutheran or a German Lutheran. Some of you, of course, married into the church, and you found out that that's the way it was. And it remained that way for a long time. In Litchfield, for example, where I grew up, there were 3 Lutheran churches in town, and they were all in the same corner of town. And there was Redeemer, and there was First, and there was Zion on adjacent corners. And if you, my father was the custodian at the Swedish Lutheran Church, so I spent a lot of time there. If I had been cutting the grass when I was 12 years old, and you would come and said to me, "Now, young man, I'm a stranger in town. I see 3 Lutheran churches here. What's the difference?" And I would have said, "Well, that's German Lutheran, this is a Swedish Lutheran, and that's Norwegian Lutheran over there." And if you had pressed me a little bit and said, "But there's got to be some difference more than that between these 3 churches," I would have scratched my head and said, "Well, I'm not sure, but I think it's got something to do with beer." And the reason is because when I'm out here cutting the grass for my dad, there's the German parsonage there, and I see the local beverage truck come up, and he carries in 2 cases of grain bales at a time. And then I say, the Norwegians, they say it's a sin to drink any kind of alcohol. What about the Swedes? I would have said, well, the Swedes, as a matter of fact, do drink some beer, but only after they pull the shade. That would have been my understanding of the difference between these Lutheran streams. Well, we stayed that way. Even for a Norwegian Lutheran boy to date a Swedish Lutheran girl would have been kind of questionable. But the wars came. And World War I and World War II were catalysts in bringing Lutherans together, because we realized we're not going to send out chaplains for all these different Lutherans, and when the refugees come, we're not going to do that separately. So we started working together, and finally, in 1960, we came together in the former American Lutheran Church, of which Zumbro was a part. And that was made up of people primarily from Norwegian and Danish and German background. 3 years later, the Lutheran Church in America was formed. That was made up of people from Finnish, Swedish, Danish, and German background. So now you've got two really large Lutheran churches, finally, in the United States. In the 1960s, the relationship with the Missouri Synod was really good. And there were even hints that maybe these three big churches are going to get together, and then 95% of all Lutherans in America will belong to the same Lutheran church. Well, in 1970, the Missouri Synod took off in a completely different direction, at least from my judgment. Many in that church didn't like that. They pulled away from that church, and then conversation began about maybe forming a church between the ALC, the LCA, and this group from the Missouri Synod. And that's what happened in 1987 when these three church bodies came together in a constituting convention in Columbus, Ohio, and they formed what we now call the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. At that time, we had more than 5 million members. There were about 11,000 congregations, 17,000 pastors. We were the fourth largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And that was the point where I was elected the first presiding bishop of the ELCA, and we divided our church into 65 synods. Glenn is here, whom you know well. He was elected bishop for this corner of Minnesota. And then across the church, there were others who were elected, and we had 65 separate synods. And then we had regions that we divided into where a group of synods would be in a part of a region and work together. And that's been our pattern since that time. Now, Blaine suggested maybe I should say a word about how I was called to be the first presiding bishop of the ELCA. We didn't have any kind of a nomination process at that time. So when we went to the convention, we had absolutely no idea who might be elected the first presiding bishop. I had people saying to me, well, Herb, you're going to get some votes. I said, well, maybe so. But I was reluctant, partly for health reasons. In 1985, I had prostate cancer, and that was followed by 2 other surgeries, and I was really operating on about 2 cylinders for about a year and a half. And as we were getting near that convention, I finally said in prayer to God, I hear these people saying that I could get elected, but I just don't have the energy to do that. There's got to be a change here. I'm going to just say to people, I'm sorry, I'm out of this. Well, whether it was answer to my prayers or just circumstances, within about 3 or 4 weeks, suddenly my energies came back in full force, and I didn't have that as an excuse. So I had to say, well, okay, we'll go to that convention, see what happens. At the convention, there were 9 ballots provided for, and we went through a process where on the first ballot, any pastor in the whole ELCA could be nominated on that nominating ballot. And there were probably, goodness, I think 200 or 300 names on that ballot. And then it gradually, through that process, winnowed down. Finally, it got down to the last 4 candidates. We had to give speeches. And I was so nervous, I gave a bad speech. In fact, my staff said, Herb, that's the worst speech you've ever given. And lost a lot of votes, and I thought, good, I'm out of it now. But things turned around, and finally David Price, who was the head of the ALC, and I were the final 2 candidates, and I was elected on the 9th ballot. And there came with that election a very deep sense of peace. I felt that the process had been worked through the church. The people of God had a chance to think about this carefully, to pray about it. So when the decision was finally made, I said, okay, Lord, this is a huge task, And the only way I'm going to be up to it is with your grace and with your help. And so I went forward with that idea. And one of the first things I did when I got to Chicago, I took a little slip of paper and put it on my desk. And I wrote on that piece of paper this prayer: Lord, help me to fear no one except you. That was my way of saying, Lord, I'm going to get direction from a lot of people. I'm going to listen to them very carefully, and your voice will be heard through them. But in the end, when I have to make tough decisions, please give me the grace to understand what I need to do. So that's kind of how I sensed the call to be the first head of the church. Now, one of the good things about the beginning of the church was that we had a marvelous staff. I can't tell you what talented people said, I will give up whatever I'm doing. I'll move to Chicago. I'll move to a synod office. I'll become a synod bishop. Highly talented people who said, I'm going to give my life for the church. And I'm so grateful as I look back now over these 25 years for all the people who said, I'm willing to serve. Now, I want to transition at this point, talk a little bit about these two books that I brought with me. And this one is one that my wife and I co-authored about a year and a half ago. It's called, as Dwayne said, Every Morning New. The reason this is an important part of my topic is that my understanding of the church is that as important as our pastors are, and as important as it is for you to gather here on Sunday morning and many times during the week, the real key to a vital church is in our homes and in our apartments or wherever you happen to live. And I'm so thankful for having grown up in a family where having daily devotions was part of daily life. During the Great Depression, in the mid-1930s, my folks had to give up farming, and it was tough. For a year and a half, they had to live apart. My mother took 5 of us and went to live with her parents on their farm. My dad took 2 of my siblings, went to live with his folks, and they had to live that way for about a year and a half. But it was a blessing because my maternal grandmother was a very devout Christian. And every evening after dinner, she would reach for 2 books, the Bible and a devotional book. And she would then sit down at the table. And even though I was a very rambunctious 4-year-old kid, I knew that this was a time to be quiet. She read from her Swedish Bible. I didn't understand a word of it. And she read then from a psalm book, a devotional book. I didn't understand that either. But I knew that there was something special about this book, the Bible, and something good about the other book, the devotional book. And that was part of my very early formation. So for all of our married life, now 60 years next summer, my wife and I have always begun the day, no matter how busy we are, by taking some time for daily devotion. And that's what this book is about. It's got a devotional thought for every day, together with a suggested Bible reading, and it's been going extremely well. In fact, we picked up the 7th printing the other day on our way back from the retreat up in Wisconsin. And so I do highly recommend that you think about it. The picture on the cover is not a barn. You might think it's a barn. It's actually a very quaint little country church in the heart of Sweden where my family has its roots. And it's a photograph that I wanted on the cover, and I didn't have one. I wrote to a cousin in Sweden and said, do you happen to have a picture of that church? He said, Herb, I was there 2 weeks ago for my aunt's funeral, and here's the picture. And so he sent it to me by email through the internet, and I was able to use it for the cover. So I'd highly recommend that. We had a call not long ago from a woman way up in Roseau, Minnesota. She said, you know, Stan and I have been married for 50 years, and we've been so busy. We've both been teachers. We thought we didn't have time for devotion. Now we do. And she said, this has opened up wonderful conversations for us that we should have had long ago. So whether you're alone in your apartment or whatever, or a couple or family, please think about daily devotions. And not to let Walmart or Target get ahead of me, a wonderful Christmas gift. If you have children that you want to encourage to have daily devotions, or friends, think about this as a gift for them. Then I want to talk mainly about the other book and tie it in with my comments today about the church. When I was elected back in 1987, I got a ton of mail from all kinds of people. Congratulations, and this is what you ought to do. And a few said, Herb, old friend, I need a job. And then there was one letter. It came from a man that you probably don't know. I doubt if anyone here recognizes it. His name was Ted Bachman, Theodore Bachman, Dr. Theodore Bachman. He was a churchman of the highest water back in the 1950s and 60s. By 1987, he was about as old as I am now. But he was the kind of person that was willing to do whatever the church asked him to do. And he had many important positions and highly respected. I met him a couple of times and knew that this was someone to listen to. His letter came across my desk, and he said this to me, basically, Herb, you have been given a huge responsibility and a great privilege. And someday, because you will see things from a vantage point, no one else will see them. Someday you must write a record of what this is like. So what you have in this book is a story of my life, growing up at Litchfield, Augsburg College, seminary, and my career as teaching and the early years as a bishop. But the book is primarily about my life in the church, and is focused specifically on the birth, the formation, and the early years of the evangelical Lutheran Church in America. What pleases me in the responses I get from the folks who read the book, two things. One is that so many of them have said, I just didn't realize how gigantic the task was bringing this church together, how much was involved. I've got a much better understanding now of who we are as a Lutheran church. That pleases me. The second thing that pleases me even more are the number of people who said, you know, Herb, that's your story, but it's my story as well. Because I try to be very direct in this book, talking about pivotal points in my life where things could have gone in many different directions. I look back and I say, I think God was at work in that. One of the early stories I tell is from my days of confirmation. In fact, this I talked about with my driver. Friends took me over here this morning, and that fella, they weren't able to be here for this, but he happened to be confirmed here at Zumbro. And left the church right away because they lived closer to Gloria Dei. So then he was able to walk over there. But we were, I was telling him how I disliked confirmation. Oh, I disliked it. Saturday morning, 2 hours sitting there when I could be out playing basketball or football or baseball or hunting or fishing. I'd much rather do that. I thought it was boring as could be. And I had a speech all prepared for my parents, which I was going to give to them on my confirmation day. And the speech was going to go something like this. Okay, folks, I went to Sunday school. I even went to junior choir, which I hated worse than confirmation. I went there, though. And now I've been confirmed. And next Sunday, if I want to go to church, I will. But if I don't want to go to church, I won't. That was a speech I prepared. I never gave it. The reason was because about 2 or 3 months before confirmation, my friends started talking about going to Green Lake Bible Camp. Anyone been to Green Lake Bible Camp? Every time I ask that question, people raise their hand. Green Lake Bible Camp near Spicer. And they said that they were going to go there. Well, I didn't want to know more about the Bible. I'd had my fill of that. But they said there are girls coming there. And they're coming from exotic places like Candy, Ohio, and Hector, and Wilmer, and Benson. So I thought, well, they got to be better looking than the girls of Litchfield, so let's go. And I went. And that was a turning point, because I tell you, even though I had heard these things many times before that, certainly in Sunday school and family and so on, somehow getting away from home and listening to Bible teachers, and then in the cabins at night, there were counselors from Gustavus Adolphus College who were preparing for the ministry, and they were so on fire for Christ and the gospel, and it was transformative for me. I never gave that speech to my parents, because by the time I came home, I was quite a different young man. I started reading my Bible every day and finished it before I completed high school. And I got very active in the youth program. That's when I'm talking about call now. That's when I first heard a sense that maybe God wants me to be a pastor someday. And for others, the direction may have been towards some other career. But this sense of calling is so important to us, because there again we begin not with what I want to do, how much money I want to make in life, but how has God gifted me with something that I could use to be a blessing to the world? And eventually for me that became a question of should I become a pastor? And by the time I was in my first year after high school, I was clear about that. And then I went on and prepared and went on my way. And I think if you were to tell your stories here today, each of you individually, you would be saying the same thing. You'd be looking back and saying, you know, at that particular point in life, unexpectedly, without my planning for it, God came into my life. Maybe it was someone you met, or maybe it was a job that came along that you didn't expect it was going to come your way, or maybe the person you were going to marry someday, or the person who would become your very dearest friend or partner. You look back and say, you know, I think God was in that. That was when God called me to something. And then all along through life, that thing, that keeps happening as the call from God unfolds. And many of you now are in the older years of life, retired, I can see that. And you look back and you say, you know, I may have made some mistakes in my life, but God never abandoned me. God was with me there all the way. So that's why I'm so pleased, those who say it's your story, but it's my story as well. Now, what about the whole church? Let me say a little bit about how we operate as an ELCA, because we tend to take this for granted. For example, we've had some rough times. We've had some bumps along the way. This is not new. Once in a while, someone would say, oh, if we could just get back to the New Testament, more like those first Christians, it would be so peaceful in the church. We wouldn't have any disagreements. I know why you're laughing, because every book that Paul wrote, every letter he wrote, was to a problem in the church. Every one of them. It's full of that. That's the way it is. We're human. And in spite of our humanness, God comes and helps us through those tough times. But it's been a tough ride for the ELCA. First of all, we've lost quite a few members. Why? There are several reasons. Number one, the countryside has changed. On our way back from Arizona last spring, we drove through the southeastern corner of South Dakota, where my wife grew up on a farm north of Vermilion. When I went there to date her, when we were first dating in the early 1950s, there was a farm on every quarter section. No more than a half section was farmed by any farmer at that time. The church out in the open country was booming. The Sunday school was full of kids. They even supported a missionary in Madagascar, all by that country church. Now, when you go through there, what's left? A monument. The church is gone. There's a cemetery down the road, but there's nothing of the church left. And the farms are now sections, not quarter sections, but sections of land. And some of them farming maybe 2 or 3 sections of land. The landscape has changed dramatically, and for that reason, our church has lost. It hasn't been just recently, but from 1960 and on, if you trace what's happening, you'll see that the line has gone down steadily all those years. Another reason is because some people leave the church when we try to deal with a complicated issue. And I'd like people to understand, we do that very deliberately. There are 3 basic kinds of churches. First of all, you have a completely independent church. Someone with a great personality and great speaking skills can go out here in the suburbs of Rochester or downtown or wherever, and they can plant a church and they can begin preaching, and people can come in. And the church sometimes, if it's a dynamic personality, will grow by leaps and bounds. They may have a couple thousand members, but they're strictly independent. And they make up their mind on things locally. They don't have the benefit of people across the country. At the other extreme, you have the hierarchical model, which is more like the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches. If you ask your Catholic friends, how do you discuss and decide on the question of abortion? Well, they say, we wait till someone tells us. And usually that's from Rome, a group of older men, and they do invite, of course, input from others, but basically that's where the word comes, and that's a hierarchical kind of church. We are very democratic. When we are going to make up our decision about, let's take sexuality for example. In 1989, there were 13 synods which said, we want our church to study family life and human sexuality. came from the grassroots. I was presiding bishop, and I tell you, we weren't ready for that at the time. We didn't want to deal with it, as far as I was concerned, but we had to, because the church was asking for it. So we started the process of thinking about that. And we do that by, first of all, forming a task force. It may be 25 or 30 people. We involve those who have expertise in the field. We involve a majority, always, of lay people, 60% lay people, 40% clergy. We try to involve people who have expertise in the field. We try to take people from rural and urban backgrounds, suburban backgrounds. We put a task force together, and then they begin to work on the question. When they get to a certain point, they issue a first draft, and we send that to the whole church. And we send it to every pastor. We say, study this with your people. And I have to say, frankly, that's where the system runs into a problem, because we have too many pastors who will say, ooh, this is going to be tough. And it goes to the bottom. And they never talk about it. And then people wonder, why weren't we invited to give our opinion? They could have, if the pastor said, okay, folks, we've got to talk about this because it's an important issue. And then when we get the first draft, and we get responses from that, it goes through the task force again. Finally, it will come to a division of the church. They will work on it. Finally, it will come to the church council. They will work on it. And when they get it done, they send it to the church-wide assembly. That's 1,000 people. 60% are lay people. 40% are clergy. And they gather in this convention every 2 or 3 years, and that's where they hash it out. And several things can happen. First of all, they may say, this is not quite ready. Send it back to the task force for more study. And that has happened. Or they may say, well, this is so great, we'll accept it exactly as it is. That's never happened. Never happened. Instead, they talk about it, they revise it, and finally they vote on it. And if it's a very important issue, it requires a 2/3 majority vote. Now, if you can think of a more democratic process than that, I'd certainly like to know what it is. And we do keep refining it, but that's how we make up our mind about things in the ELC, and it's very important that you folks understand that. We also say this, and this is extremely important. When we adopt a statement, it's never binding on an individual conscience. So I'll give you an example. My wife and I do not agree on the death penalty. One of us believes that it should never be imposed because we're just asking the state to do what we'd rather not do. The other thinks that, well, maybe there are times, especially if it's a crime against a child and murder, when the death penalty is deserved. Now, we don't agree about that. We disagree. Should we form separate churches? Of course not. Because this is not the heart of our faith. The heart of our faith is what I started talking about at the beginning. We're saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. That's the glue that binds us together. We are bound together by word and sacrament. And we can have different opinions. But it is helpful for the church to establish a point of view to guide and help us in our daily thinking. That's how we make up our mind in the ELCA. Now, let me just say, too, a word about one other big reason why we're seeing some losses in the church, and that is that we're having a generational issue. I tested this in my own family one time, and this is what I came out with. If you begin with my parents, small town, my dad was a common laborer up here in Litchfield, and my mother housewife, and Koreans, farmer folks in South Dakota, they were Lutheran. And they could trace their Lutheran heritage all the way back to Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, to the Reformation. And they had 13 children among the two of them. And all of 13 of us have been very active in the church, very active. Now go to the next generation. And the picture changes dramatically, and I'm guessing for everyone in this room, you see the same thing. There are 33 in that next generation. I sat down one day and graphed this out. Only 10 of them are ELCA Lutherans. There are about another 15 who are in every denomination you can imagine, partly because of personal preference, but partly because of marriage, partly because of where they happen to live. And they range from Quaker to Presbyterian, to Southern Baptist, to Assemblies of God, to Roman Catholic, to Missouri Synod, to Evangelical Covenant, to Presbyterian. They're scattered. And that's the way it is. But then we've got probably half a dozen or more of my nephews and nieces and children who would say, well, you know, I'm religious, but I just don't care for the church. My nephew's wife said, you know, Uncle Herb, we don't go to church anymore, but please don't think we're not spiritual. We are very spiritual. And then there are those, like two of our godsons, who are atheists. And they're very open about this. They say, hey, Uncle Herb, we've thought through this, although I don't think they have thought through it very carefully, but they say, we think we've thought through it, and we've chosen not to believe. And it's because of these two groups. We call the one group the nones, N-O-N-E-S, because they say, okay, I'm spiritual, but I'm a non-participant in an organized church. And then the growing number of atheists in our country. That's the kind of culture we are. So if you get to the question, which you wanted me to address too, Dwayne, what do I think about the future? I learned as a synod bishop to be careful about predictions. I was elected to bishop in 1976 in Minnesota. By 1980, I guess I thought I was pretty smart. Because I sat down and I wrote a pastoral letter to all of our pastors. We had about 600 of them here in Minnesota. And I said, okay, folks, this is what I see coming in the next decade. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm so glad they didn't keep that letter. Because I found it later on that decade. I looked at it and I said, you know, I was right on about 1 out of 5. We really can't know what's down the road for us. The only thing we can know for sure is that we know what's at the heart of the gospel. And so what I say to pastors and congregations, think of innovative ways to do it. Certainly, worship services ought to be alive, and we can use both contemporary and traditional. We can do all kinds of things, but remember that the heart and core of it is still back to that word and sacrament. It's still back to the basic proclamation of the gospel. We've got to stick to that. And then, come what may, I think we have a great future. One of the things that really encourages me about the ELCA right now is that we are organizing new congregations in places that are totally different from what I'm looking at here. The future, folks, I hate to say this, is not with Northern European background folks and their descendants. The future is with this mix that's coming in. And so I think last year there were something like 45 or 50 new mission starts in communities of people that are not like the Northern Europeans that we are so accustomed to. And that means that if Zumbro is going to have a future, we've got to be thinking constantly about what is happening in the community around us and what are we doing to bring these folks into the church. And even though these new communities of faith are not bursting at the seams, you have to remember that sometimes you can work a long time in a particular community. Suddenly things burst out. Give you one example. In Namibia, Southwest Africa, the Finnish Lutheran Church went there in the late 1800s, and they worked for 20 years with only a few baptisms. And they thought, why are we putting all this effort into this country? And suddenly exploded. And today, churches in Africa are growing by leaps and bounds. And in Namibia, probably 70% of the people are Lutheran because of the faithfulness of that beginning. So I can't predict what's going to happen, but my strong hope is that in these new communities, we're going to see some things happening that could be very surprising. One of the most pleasant memories I carried with me from my time as presiding bishop was a visit to the Rio Grande Valley, where one of our Hispanic pastors had been working very hard, and I was invited that day to stand beside him and baptize 13 new members of the congregation, who ranged from an infant to a man in his 40s who was about to head north for the migrant fields. That's where the future is, if there's a future for the Lutheran Church. Now, Dwayne, oh man, I got so many things I'd like to talk about, but you said I should wind down because we're going to have some time for questions, but there are 90,000 things I should have talked about. But anyone want to throw a question at me?
Let's raise your hand and I'll bring the mic around so we can do that. But you've been listening to an evangelical Christian with a radical social conscience. What questions do you want to direct to Bishop Chilstrom? Okay, Dick.
Thank you very much. impressed not only by what you said, but the fact that you did it without any notes.
I've been around.
Many of your comments were made in the context of the church, including many of your comments about the devotional. Could you make a comment or two about the importance of that devotional relative to your personal relationship with God?
Yes. If you go back to the story I told about Bible camp, I came home, I started reading the Bible, and I was determined to read every word of it, including the Selahs and the begats and all those things that you find that are very boring. I stuck with it. And the thing that I discovered in my devotional life is that you can read for several days and there's nothing particularly inspiring, especially in some parts of the Bible. And then all of a sudden you come to a verse and it almost jumps off the page. And you say, well, this is the word I needed right for this day. And it becomes very personal to you. And that's why I encourage devotional life, because it's a moment to be quiet. It's almost like you just open up the doors and you say, okay, Lord, I've had a very busy day, or I'm going to have a very busy day, and I just would like some insight. And it comes in surprising ways. That's what devotional life means to me. And of course, worship is important because it happens there too, but it's in that private devotional life that I think you have those moments of inspiration. So I really do encourage you to do that. And don't get discouraged when you're in part of the Bible that seems kind of boring. Just keep at it. And of course, use devotional helps, because they will often unlock a text and you'll see things that you never were able to see without the help of someone else.
Yes.
I have a question. You were talking about how the pastors sometimes put the studies from the main church in the pile, in the bottom of the pile, and didn't want to talk about it because it was going to upset people. Do you think nowadays that the headquarters do communicate directly because of the internet, and is that effective, or do you know about that?
Yeah, you're in a world that I'm not too familiar with. All of that came on like gangbusters, and of course I can't keep up with it now. But yes, I think you're true. I think that's true. There's a lot of stuff going on in the internet. Pastors now have access to communication. We get our newsletter now on the internet through our email process. I think that's true. Whether people take time for that, that's really hard to measure, but certainly there are many ways that can be done. And as you know, if you're adept with your computer, just go on the ELCA website. If you want to know what does the church believe about abortion or gun control or homosexuality, whatever, just go there and it's all there. And you can read it for yourself. Yes, that's a good question. Whereas earlier, we really had to depend almost exclusively on that local pastors spreading the material. Thank you.
Probably when you ask your question, give your name so we can get acquainted with each other around here too.
Okay, I'm Maury Hagan, a retired ELCA pastor, and you and I had supper together at a Southwestern Minnesota District Convention. Jerry Ahmet was a good friend of yours, I think?
Yep.
Yep, and Jerry was a good friend of mine.
Okay, and I think you paid, didn't you?
Jerry did.
I owe him one.
But anyway, you mentioned about how pastors can slip it under the pile, and that is true. It can happen. When the issue of homosexuality was on the floor, and I retired in 2008 after serving at Grace Lutheran in Laverne, Minnesota for 15 and a half years. And my associate and I talked about how should we present this to the people. We didn't want to sweep it under. We needed to talk about it, yet we didn't want to embellish it either.
Yeah.
So we gave opportunity for, and we had these forums. And we also offered, if you want to continue discussion, we certainly can do that. But our original plan was to have 2 times, and then the groups thought, well, let's do it at least 3 more times. We didn't make it to the 4th time. It kind of fizzled out. But nevertheless, we gave opportunity.
Yeah,
After I retired in 2008, the congregation had 2 interims coming in at the same time. We also had some controversy and discord because there was a handful of people that really wanted the congregation to pull out of the ELCA. And they also accused me, their senior pastor, and my associate for not even giving opportunity to discuss homosexuality when it was coming to a vote at the ELCA in 2009. Thankfully, I could prove it to the senior interim that this was not the case, and I presented him through the internet an outline we had for discussion. And so what my point is, we can still communicate to our people, and yet people as they are don't pick up on that communication. And I think that is a serious problem that we have in life in general, especially in the church and also in politics.
Yeah, right. You're absolutely right. Let's see.
One of the joys of serving in the ELCA with you, Herb, was your love of the church, but your forward thinking in terms of the ecumenical scene that started under your leadership. And I just wanted to know how you're feeling about where we are as a church today in our ecumenical journey.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Glenn. And by the way, we've got wonderful friendship going. I can't tell you what a joy it was this week to be with some of the bishops and their spouses, because we got thrown into this, you know, and wondered where we're going. So we had to glom together and figure things out. And I have that wonderful relationship with all the bishops and their spouses. I'm always thankful for that. Ecumenically, yes. We've got a dark side and a bright side. The dark side is our relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. When I was bishop in Minnesota in the 1970s and 80s, it was so wonderful. We got together every year as bishops of the Catholic and Lutheran background. They had about 8, we had about 8. We'd get together from noon to noon. And during that time, we forged some wonderful friendships. Raymond Lucker was the bishop in the New Ulm Diocese, and he was very forward-thinking. I felt so bonded with him, and also Archbishop Roach. What we didn't realize was that John Paul II was a very rigid Roman Catholic. And although he had this wonderful public persona, he was like an iron fist in a silk glove. And he was determined to really clamp down on those who were more progressive. And so he replaced some of those bishops who were more ecumenical with those who were more conservative. You can see Exhibit A of that here in Minnesota now, where Archbishop Neinstedt has very little communication with Lutherans now. I think there's some going on, but it's nothing like it used to be. And so we're having to hope now that with Pope Francis we can move back toward the kind of thing we had under John the 23rd, when it was so, like the windows had opened, there was a fresh breeze coming out of Rome. I think that's going to happen again. On the other hand, with Protestants, we made significant progress. We determined, this started in our predecessor churches, and we continued it in the ELCA, to have conversation with those that we thought we could build a deeper relationship with. For example, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopal Church, the Moravians, and the United Church of Christ, because we felt that there was a common understanding of Word and Sacrament. So we talked to each other a good deal. And finally, out of those conversations came what we call full communion. And what that means is that we agree on Word and Sacrament. And what that means practically is that we can share ministries. So, for example, if you go out near the Slayton area, where we've had such great losses, now if there's a Presbyterian church and a Lutheran church in a little town out there, they can call a pastor together. And it might be a Presbyterian this time, it might be a Lutheran the next time, but those congregations can keep on working and working more closely than ever. In the inner city, we've had some significant success in working with the Episcopal Church, where we formed community organizations with them, and we can do and worship services as well. And so this is one of the really good outcomes of the ecumenical movement, is that we're doing what we dreamed of doing. Now we're actually doing it. We're working together in Word and Sacrament and practical ministries in the community. So a lot of that's going on. I think that's all for the good. Yes?
Thank you, Bishop, for your presence here today. I would be interested in hearing some of the thoughts that you might have. First off, my name is Wayne Vogt. I would be interested in hearing some of the thoughts you might have concerning the things that are going on at the national level, especially with the leaders of our country. As quiet Lutherans, how involved, how vocal should we really be in trying to bring about changes for the better of the whole country, the world at large? How active should we be as Lutherans within this nation that we have been blessed with? Thank you.
That's a good question and a tough one too, but after I retired, said to myself, I've always encouraged people to get involved in politics. Now I didn't need to do it myself. So I'm way up there. We were living in northwestern Minnesota at the time, and I joined one of the parties, and I got very involved and even went to a state convention. I learned at that state convention that if you think that the church has conventions that are kind of unruly, it's nothing compared to what I never figured out what they were doing there. Yet, it was very important to be involved. Now, the distinction we make in the Lutheran Church is that we believe we ought to inform our people what the issues are about. Then you, as an individual, in your own conscience, ask the question, how do I feel about this and where do I take action? And then support the people that you think ought to be elected. We do not, from our pulpits, advocate for individual candidates. No matter how strong a pastor may feel about a certain candidate, it is wrong for that pastor to get to the pulpit and say, you ought to vote for so-and-so for this reason. Rather, we lay out the issues, and then we say to our people, now you go and get involved. It's always been sad to me that we've had so few Lutherans, so very few Lutherans who get into elective offices in our local and state and federal government. And I would encourage those of you who have that inclination to think about either doing that yourself or encouraging fellow Lutherans to do that, because we have a good theology, and that can work itself out in the public arena. And maybe the most important thing we ought to do is pray for those who are leadership. I don't care who's president. My wife and I make it a point to pray for our president, whether it's Reagan or Kennedy or now our President Obama, to pray for them, because they really need the help of the Spirit in making these critical decisions that have such an impact on so many people. What's going on in Washington now, of course, is shameful. I think that people of goodwill can't somehow work out compromises. Compromise must be the rule, even though we have strong opinions about things. And then having made a decision to go along with that and support those who have to carry that out.
One more quick question.
Yes.
It's actually a comment. I'm Ann Peterson, and that is in response to your comment about looking on the ELCA website for information. There is just a wealth of resource there, but also I would encourage you to look at the Southeast Minnesota Synod website, which is semnsynod.org, and there are all sorts of wonderful resources there, and also you can sign up for certain links there so that you automatically get updates. There's a wonderful one called Steps of the Steward that gives you ideas of ways you can be a better steward individually and also as congregations. So check out that website too.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for being with you today. The books are back there. The devotional book, $15. The autobiography is $30. If you don't have a personal check or cash enough for the autobiography, you can get that one with a credit card, not the smaller book, but the larger book if you want to use a credit card for that. But I hope you enjoy them. And the last comment is this: when you've written your autobiography, it has a very profound impact on you, because you look at that book and you say, this is one thing I'm never going to do again. And you start thinking about the last things of life. And whether you write your autobiography or not, I would encourage you to do that, even if it's a few pages, write about your life. Whether you do or not, you have written your autobiography. Your life is a witness to who you are and what you stand for. And so don't forget that. And my brother died 2 years ago. He was handicapped for all of his 78 years. but he had a beautiful faith, and at the end he said two things. He said, "Thank you, Lord, for everything." And then the last words he spoke to us before he died was, "I'm going to be all right." And beautiful childlike faith. And if you and I can come to the end of our days and say, "Thank you, Lord, for everything, and I'm going to be all right because of Jesus," what could be better than that? So thanks for the time today.
Herb, thanks for your presence today.